Alright, I've skipped leg day for long enough. Time to get some reps in. Nice. So I'm going to cut two holes here, one for the speaker specifically, and then one for the battery. I'm going to put some holes in this later for the switches and other things. Right now I'm just going to focus on getting these main holes done because I'm actually going to glue some plasticard to offset these even more so the battery and the speaker fit even better. The jeweler saw makes really quick work of this plastic. It goes through real nice, but honestly, the big key thing here is the bench block. I've cut a V into mine so I have a nice spot where I can brace both sides of the plastic as I cut through the middle. I think the bench block is just about as important as the saw to do this kind of stuff. Now here I'm getting a little stuck and I'm going to go ahead and cut across because the throat of the saw isn't deep enough. So I'm going to have to take this in two cuts. Totally easy, not that big of a deal, but it is something to be aware of is how deep your throat is. Now I'm just going to open this hole just a little bit to make sure the speaker fits the way it's supposed to. Cut out a little small, so we're just going to make sure everything fits before we go on to the next step. So the next step is to create a little bit more space here under the base. I'm going to take a piece of 2mm by 2mm plasticard rod here. This is just kind of a square rod, and I'm going to glue this in little bits all the way around the holes that I've cut out. This will give me a little bit more space, and I'll end up topping this off with a piece of plasticard, and then all of the basing stuff will go on top of that, and you'll never know that I made any extra space. Now that I have a nice raised base here, I'm going to put a piece of plasticard over this. I'm just kind of test fitting. This doesn't have to be perfect because I'm going to cover this all with basing material anyway. So as long as it fits reasonably well and has a good space underneath for the battery, everything will be fine. One of the things I didn't do here that I ended up doing later is actually cutting away a piece of the section at the top where the battery connector is going to go. I ended up needing a little bit more space for that, so I ended up cutting out a piece, adding some more of the plasticard 2mm by 2mm rod, and then gluing yet another piece of plasticard a little bit deeper so I had a little bit more space for the battery connector. The next step here, I'm going to use some photo etched brass from Green Stuff World. There's a whole bunch of different companies that make this kind of stuff, and there's a whole bunch of different versions with different holes, square holes, circular holes, hexagonal holes. Pretty much anything's going to work as long as you have some sort of mesh to put the speaker behind so you can actually hear when the speaker does its thing. I put a link in the description for the mesh that I used from Green Stuff World. Now if you're looking for sound files, STL files, or code, you can join my Patreon and get access to all of those. Now that I'm happy with the size, I'm going to glue this in place. Now this is only a little strip because this is a bit of scrap that I had. I'm going to put plasticards to finish off this actual enclosure here. But because I'm doing a whole destroyed urban rebel base style, it's kind of cool to have this thing kind of half covered, and it doesn't take much to get the sound to actually come through the holes. So I have the instructions out because oddly enough, these legs aren't really that posable, and the pistons actually have a specific place to go so that the ball joint of the foot will actually fit correctly. The advantage of that being that the legs are only one piece and it's pretty easy to get the wires to go all the way through. All we really have to do is drill a hole into the actual foot plate and cut a small relief in the knee joint. And as for how many wires, well, that's an interesting question. It's going to depend on what you're putting in there. For me, I have 2 wires for the speakers. I'm going to have 2 wires for the button because I'm going to have this as one of these swappable ones. And then I have 2 wires for power in and power out. With the armature, I don't actually have the speaker wires going through the legs because I'm actually putting the soundboard in the base itself, so that gets wired a little bit differently. I'm color coding all of the wires here so I know what's what when I actually get into the night body. Now I have the red and black splitting off into 2. It actually should be 3 because I need to go ahead and power my Arduino, my soundboard, and all of these nights are using an LED driver that needs its own separate power. And of course I'm keeping track of all the different colors and what they're supposed to go to in a spreadsheet. It's really the only way I can track all the different projects I do, and it allows me to go back and change something if something goes wrong or anything that happens in the future, or I just shelf the project for a couple years like I did with these because I learned that 9th edition was coming out. It's definitely key to make sure you get a good amount of shrink wrap and a good coverage on that so you're not shorting any of these wires out inside the body, because once this is all glued together, there's no way you're going to be able to get back in there. And now that I got this crazy looking thing sorted, it's time to get this onto the base. I'm going to use some of these cast bits of cork. Here's a video on how I did these. I'm going to drill a hole through them to get the wiring through, and then the cork, or the not cork, gets glued up to the foot here. Now this will glue onto the base, give me some nice texture, it looks really good, and it hides all the wires really, really well. And once the resin bit is glued to the other foot, I can drill a little hole here in the base next to the battery compartment. I'm going to run all the wires through here. That way I can deal with them on the other side. Now for this one, I've put the wires through both legs. Some of them I put all the wires through one leg. Either way you do it, you got to get the wires to the other side of the base. Now we got some glue on here. I'm actually going to clamp these down to make sure they actually glue where I want them to and don't shift while the glue is drying. Alright, for these other holes here, I need to get a on-off switch, the switch bank so I can switch between weapons, as well as the button to actually activate all of the pew-pew noises and whatnot. The key here I have found is not to use glue. I've glued these in before and I've had super glue and epoxy resin both seep into the switch mechanism and then I had to rip the whole thing out. So I just actually push this in with green stuff. Green stuff seems to hold it well enough and it won't seep into the actual mechanisms. So now that I have the basing stuff linked to that video here, I need to get the button in. I always do this after I put the basing stuff on so that doesn't end up messing it up. I also always try to put a piece of resin right over where the button is so it's a little easier. Oddly enough, I've never had any problems with the paint getting into that mechanism, but it's the same process with the green stuff otherwise. So I've got my battle foam here that makes it really easy to do the bottom of these bases and get all the wiring done. Now we can see on the other side here, I have just a whole mess of wires and nothing makes any sense. How am I going to solve this? My multimeter. Now you can spend tons of money on Multimeter getting a bunch of features that you may or may not need. For this is a really cheap one. I think this was like around $10. I'll put a link in the description. In this case, I'm going to use it for continuity to figure out which wire is the black wire from the other side. We're going to check the other one as well just to make sure that the red is not connected to the black and we don't have a short. And just because it's not connected to the black doesn't mean it's not actually connected to the red. So we're going to check that as well. So now to get the battery plug in place, I'm going to solder the black wire to the switch so I can actually turn it on and off. And then that is actually wired around the battery. That's the long red wire there that then goes up the leg. The other one, I'm going to come around the other side to connect that into the leg. I'm cutting out some of these support beams to actually get the wires through a little bit more flat to the base. And this is another reason it's actually important to do all of your basing beforehand, because that glue, when it dries, can bend and warp your base if you're not careful. Every now and then, I'll come in with this metal ruler to make sure nothing's protruding too far out in the base. This way I can push it in as I glue everything down so I don't have a wobbly model. Now you may have noticed there's another wire connected to that side of the switch. This is actually going to be my trigger wire, so this is going to be routed around into the switch, so when I press it, it will get grounded. Everything I have on the Arduino and on the soundboard is triggered when it goes to ground. So soldering the button straight to ground will get everything that I want to happen to actually happen. And that'll bring us to our actual little switchboard here. So there's 3 switches. I thought I was going to do 3 different weapons, but I ended up only doing 2, so I only have to actually wire 2 of these up. What I've done on the one side for the button is I've actually just bussed, and that means to solder all 3 of the pins into one line, and that just goes to the button. Now the other 2 will go individually to 2 different wires that are up in the body. I've color-coded those wires. Again, they're on the spreadsheet, and again I used my multimeter to figure out which wire was which. I do have 2 different colors of magnet wire, but I have 4 wires here, 2 for the speakers and 2 for buttons. Sometimes my plans go a little bit better than others. In this one, my switch bank here has to take all of its wires to the left, which means I'm going to have to wrap these wires up and around for the button, as well as for the 2 wires that go up into the leg. Now the thing to be careful here is I've actually used what's called bussing wire, which is just tinned copper wire with no insulation. And that makes it easier to solder into, but now I have to have a little bit more caution when I'm going through to make sure that I'm not crossing any of these wires. Once you get into the magnet wire, it shouldn't matter, and I'm planning on putting a little bit of epoxy resin on most of the wires on the back of this to really hold them onto the bottom of the base and make sure that I don't have anything shorting out on some weird thing that's on the table. And here's what we look like on the bottom with all the things soldered down. And now I just need to go through and find anything that's kind of peeking up a little bit. I'm going to tack it down with some super glue. The epoxy resin will give it a real solid joint, but I want to make sure that I can tack it down with super glue so as the epoxy dries, it doesn't get into a weird shape and dry too far out of the base. So I'm going to hold it down with a toothpick and then use some super glue accelerant to tack that down in place. So now we're going to come in and do a nice little battery test fit and make sure everything fits in place, including the connector. That's kind of the one thing that is a little bigger than I kind of anticipated. I could have used a smaller JST connection, but these are the ones that these batteries came with, and I didn't want to switch out the connectors. How am I holding these batteries in is kind of the next question. What I've found works best so far is the Scotch poster tack. It's a double-sided tape. I'll put a link in the description for that. I found that holds really well and lets you remove the battery. As added security, I'll add some exterior surface masking tape. It's a little bit stronger than masking tape and it'll hold it in place and kind of protect the battery. All right, I got her all painted up. Let's try her out. Feel like there's something missing. All right, sound. Here's a link to how I did the sound. You may have noticed from the last bit, I had two wires that weren't soldered anywhere, and that's because these wires are going to go to the speaker. I didn't want to have that in place while I painted, just in case I dripped paint into it and ruined the speaker. These speakers are from Adafruit, and they actually have a sticker on the top, so I just peel the sticker off and stick it in, and then work on getting these wires soldered. Now, speaker wires technically should be wired positive to positive and negative to negative, but honestly, I have found no difference if I wire them backwards. So I'm not going to worry too much about which one's which. I know both of these two wires that I have left are speaker wires, so I'm just going to strip them and solder them in place. Now that that's done, here's what we get. Now we have leg day done and you can power your miniatures. I'd like to thank my Patreon sponsors, Axel, FNS Hobbies, Drew, Joshua, Dominic, Stefan, and Felix. If you'd like to support the channel, there's a link in the description. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. And thanks for watching.